Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. And today we're going to be taking a look at something pretty interesting.
Yeah.
We're looking at the radicalization of SNCC and CORE,
Yeah.
so the Student and Nonviolent Coordinating Committee,
Right.
and the Congress of Racial Equality.
Right.
And, you know, it's funny because they both start out very committed to nonviolence and integration.
Mm-hmm.
But they end up taking this pretty dramatic turn toward Black Power by the mid-'60s.
Yeah.
And it's
So how do we get from A to B?
It's fascinating because it's almost like the things that made them so committed to nonviolence at the start are the same things that kind of push them in this other direction.
Okay, so let's unpack that a little bit. What are we talking about here? What were some of the key experiences?
Well, you have something like the Mississippi Freedom Summer
Yeah, in 64.
in 1964, and you have all of these activists, both, Black activists and white volunteers, a lot of them coming down from the north,
Right.
risking their lives to try to register Black voters and just facing incredible hostility and violence. And this is kind of a turning point, right? I mean,
Yeah.
they're putting their lives on the line, and then they see the federal government's not really there to protect them.
Exactly. And then you have something like the Democratic National Convention that same year in Atlantic City.
Yeah.
And you have the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, which was this group challenging the all-white delegation from Mississippi.
Right.
And they presented all this evidence of voter suppression, and they were ultimately denied seats at the convention.
So it's this combination of like disillusionment with how slowly things are changing,
Yeah.
the limitations of nonviolence,
Right.
and then this feeling that like the system itself is rigged
Exactly.
against them.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so enter Stokely Carmichael.
Yeah. Stokely Carmichael becomes the chairman of SNCC in 1966.
Okay.
And his rhetoric really captures this, this growing sense of frustration and this need for a more radical approach.
So Carmichael's the one who really popularizes this term Black Power.
He does. He's the one who kind of, brings it to the national stage.
Correct.
He famously said, we've been saying freedom for 6 years and we ain't got nothing. What we gonna start saying now is Black Power.
I mean, you can just feel
Right.
the anger and the determination.
Yeah.
Okay, but what does he mean by Black Power? When he says that, what's he talking about?
So for Carmichael, Black Power is about self-reliance.
Okay.
It's about racial pride. It's about Black communities taking control of their own destiny.
So it's a real shift away from integration.
Absolutely. It's a rejection of this idea that integration is the ultimate goal.
Okay.
And it's saying, no, we need to define our own terms of liberation.
So that's a pretty radical change in thinking, right?
Oh, absolutely.
So, and how does that manifest within SNCC itself?
Well, you see this in their decision to expel white members in 1966.
Okay.
This was huge symbolically. It was a way of, signaling their commitment to Black leadership and self-determination.
And this is all happening at the same time that we're seeing this rise in militancy within SNCC.
Mm-hmm. And that's where H. Rep. Brown comes in.
Oh,
So
yeah.
he becomes the head of SNCC after Carmichael steps down in 1967.
Right.
And his rhetoric is even more confrontational.
Yeah.
He really challenges the whole nonviolent philosophy.
What does he say?
He has this really famous quote, "Violence is as American as cherry pie."
Wow, that's a statement.
It is.
So what's he getting at with that?
What he's saying is that self-defense is necessary.
Okay.
It's a necessary response to the violence that Black communities are facing.
So nonviolence only works if the oppressor has a conscience.
Right. And what he's arguing is that America has shown time and time again that it doesn't have a conscience when it comes to racial justice.
So this idea of Black Power for him, it also means a willingness to fight back.
Yes, to meet violence with violence if necessary.
And you can see how his message is really resonating with a lot of people, especially in these urban Black communities that are dealing with, poverty, police brutality, systemic racism.
Absolutely. He's giving voice to that anger and frustration.
So SNCC's undergoing this pretty dramatic transformation, but they weren't the only ones, right?
Yeah.
CORE was going through a similar kind of shift.
That's right. CORE, under the leadership of Floyd McKissick, starts moving away from its, multiracial integrationist roots. And by 1966, CORE officially endorses Black Power.
Wow.
And they go even further than SNCC. They actually formally restrict their membership to African Americans.
So that's a pretty significant break from their founding principles.
It is.
What led to that?
Well, much like SNCC, they were facing this growing disillusionment with the slow pace of progress and the limitations of integration.
And imagine the events of Freedom Summer and the rejection of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, must have had a huge impact on CORE's members as well.
Definitely, those experiences really shook people's faith in the system. And this idea that integration alone was going to lead to equality.
Right.
They started to believe that Black people needed to build their own power base and define their own terms of liberation.
And this brings us to a really pivotal event that highlights this growing divide within the civil rights movement.
Yeah.
The Meredith March in 1966.
This is where you see this real clash between, those advocating for integration and those embracing Black power.
Right. You have Stokely Carmichael, leading chants of Black power.
Yeah.
Directly challenging Martin Luther King's continued advocacy for nonviolence and integration.
Exactly. And it becomes this defining moment
Yeah.
for the movement forcing activists to choose sides.
Okay, so we've got this big shift happening toward Black power. But, how does this actually translate into action?
Well, I think it's important to remember that, even as SNCC and CORE are embracing Black power, they're not completely abandoning their earlier goals.
Yeah.
They're still focused on, empowering Black communities politically, but their approach is evolving.
So give us an example of what that looks like in practice.
Well, you can look at something like voter registration.
Mm-hmm.
Initially, they had worked alongside white volunteers, especially, down in the South.
Right.
But with Black power, there's this real emphasis on organizing independently led by Black organizers from within those communities.
Makes sense. Yeah, aligns with that whole idea of self-determination.
Exactly.
Any particular campaigns that stand out as good examples of this?
Well, we've got SNCC's work in Lowndes County, Alabama.
Okay.
In 1965, they helped establish the Lowndes County Freedom Organization, which actually became known as the Black Panther Party.
Wait, the Black Panther Party, I thought that was a different group. The one based in Oakland?
You're right, the more famous Black Panther Party, that comes later in '66.
Okay.
But this Lowndes County group was actually the first one to use that Black Panther symbol.
Huh.
Yeah, and they ran candidates for local office, really focused on building political power from the ground up.
So it's about more than just advocating for change. It's actively trying to take control
Exactly.
of the political process.
Mm-hmm.
How about CORE? How does their approach to voter registration change during this time?
Well, CORE also shifts toward this, more independent organizing model.
Okay.
And they're particularly active in, northern cities, challenging all these discriminatory practices that are limiting Black political participation.
So it's not just a Southern thing anymore.
Right, exactly. The fight for Black power is a national struggle.
Mm-hmm.
It's about both de jure segregation in the South, segregation by law, and de facto segregation in the North.
Right. So even without those explicit laws,
Exactly.
you still have segregation in practice.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that the civil rights movement wasn't just about, overturning Jim Crow laws.
Right.
It was about dismantling this whole system of oppression that was, deeply embedded in American society.
Yeah.
Both North and South.
Mm-hmm. And that kind of broader focus is reflected in another key area of action during this period, community organizing.
Okay, so let's talk about that.
Yeah.
How does SNCC and CORE's approach to community organizing evolve?
Well, they recognized that political power was only, one part of the equation. They needed to address these social and economic inequalities that were holding Black communities back.
So what do they do?
They focus on building these self-help initiatives
Okay.
and creating these alternative institutions that can empower residents to take control of their own lives.
Can you give us some examples of what those initiatives look like?
Sure. So SNCC, for instance, they set up freedom schools in the South
Okay.
as an alternative to the often, inadequate and segregated public schools.
Right.
And they teach Black history. They emphasize critical thinking. They really encourage students to become active participants in the struggle.
It's amazing that they were able to create these parallel institutions within a system that was, actively trying to suppress them.
It really speaks to their resourcefulness and determination.
Mm-hmm.
They weren't just waiting for the system to change. They were building their own solutions.
How about CORE? What are they doing in terms of community organizing?
Well, CORE is very active in urban areas, setting up community centers that offer things like job training and healthcare services and legal aid.
Okay.
And they're really tackling issues like housing discrimination and police brutality.
So really trying to get at the root causes
Yeah.
of poverty and inequality, not just the symptoms.
Exactly. They understood that, True liberation couldn't be achieved through political rights alone.
Right.
It also required economic empowerment, access to resources control over the institutions that are shaping people's lives.
And I think it's important to point out that this focus on community organizing really lays the groundwork for a lot of, future social justice movements.
Absolutely.
Oh.
The strategies and tactics that SNCC and CORE developed during this period become incredibly influential. They show the power of grassroots organizing, the importance of addressing systemic issues, the need for these community-based solutions.
Yeah.
And these are ideas that are going to be picked up and carried forward by, countless other movements in the years to come.
So it's not just about these practical programs and services,
Right.
but it's also about changing the narrative.
Yeah.
Instilling this sense of pride and agency in Black communities.
Absolutely. They're promoting Black culture and history and art. They're challenging those negative stereotypes that are so pervasive in, mainstream media. And they're really emphasizing the beauty and the resilience and the contributions of Black people.
So it's about reclaiming their narrative, their identity, their power.
Exactly. It's about shifting that balance of power, not just in politics and economics,
Right.
also in the cultural realm.
That's fascinating. So it seems like even though SNCC and CORE are relatively short-lived as organizations,
Yeah.
their ideas and actions have this lasting impact that extends far beyond, their own time.
Without a doubt, their embrace of Black power was a turning point in the civil rights movement. It pushed the struggle for racial justice in these new and radical directions. But, it's also important to acknowledge that this period wasn't without its challenges.
What do you mean?
Well, we've been talking about the successes and the inspiring aspects of Black power.
Right.
But there were also internal tensions and external pressures, and ultimately, this sense of unfulfilled promises that's going to contribute to the decline of both organizations.
So the story doesn't end with this nice, neat resolution.
Not quite. There's more to unpack, more complexities to explore.
And that's what we'll be diving into in the final part of our deep dive.
All right, so we're back. And we've been talking about this incredible shift toward Black power within SNCC and CORE. And it's an inspiring story, but as we kind of hinted at, there are also some pretty significant challenges.
Yeah, what's important to remember is that even with this shared embrace of Black power, there wasn't always agreement on, how to actually put those ideas into practice. So even within these organizations, there were tensions and disagreements.
Absolutely. There were debates about the role of violence, the relationship with white allies, and even just the most effective strategies for achieving Black liberation.
I mean, that sounds like a really complex and difficult set of questions to grapple with.
It was, and those disagreements sometimes led to, factionalism and infighting, which ultimately weakened these groups, especially as they faced increasing pressure from, the government.
Right. And we talked earlier about the FBI's COINTELPRO program. Can you remind us how that program targeted SNCC and CORE?
Well, COINTELPRO was this covert FBI operation that was aimed at disrupting and discrediting groups that the government considered subversive.
Okay.
And they used a whole range of tactics against SNCC and CORE.
Like what kind of tactics are we talking about?
Well, surveillance and infiltration were really common. They would plant informants within the organizations to gather intelligence and try to sow discord.
Wow.
But they also went further. They would spread disinformation to discredit these groups and even instigate violence to create this climate of fear and instability.
It's hard to even imagine what it must have been like for those activists trying to, fight for social justice while also being targeted and undermined by their own government.
Yeah, it was incredibly challenging both strategically and emotionally. It created this atmosphere of paranoia and distrust,
Right.
which made it very difficult to organize effectively. And it just took a huge psychological toll on the people involved.
So you have these internal tensions. You have the external pressure from the government. And then on top of all of that, you have the weight of these, unfulfilled promises, despite all the gains of the civil rights movement. Real equality still seemed so far out of reach.
And that's a crucial point. The persistence of poverty, police brutality, and discrimination in, housing, employment, all of these things were a source of deep disillusionment for many activists who had dedicated their lives to this fight.
Yeah, I can only imagine how disheartening it must have been to risk everything, only to see these systemic problems persist.
It was a period of profound disillusionment for many, and those unfulfilled promises, coupled with the internal conflicts and the external pressures, ultimately contributed to the decline of both SNCC and CORE.
So what happens to them?
Well, SNCC ends up disbanding in 1969 and CORE, although it technically still exists, loses a lot of its influence and membership during this time.
That's a sad ending to such a powerful and important movement.
It is, but it's also important to remember that their legacy extends far beyond, their organizational lifespan.
Okay.
The ideas that they championed, the strategies they developed, the sacrifices they made, all of that had a profound and lasting impact on the fight for racial justice in America.
So even in their decline, they planted seeds for future generations of activists.
Exactly. They helped to shift the national conversation on race. They pushed the boundaries of what was considered acceptable, and they inspired countless others to continue the fight.
All right, so as we wrap up this deep dive, what are some of the key takeaways you want our listeners to remember about this period? What are the most important things we've learned?
Well, I think the first takeaway is just the importance of understanding the complexity and the nuance of the Black Power movement.
Yeah.
It wasn't a monolithic entity.
Right.
There were different interpretations, different approaches, and internal disagreements about the best way forward.
It was a dynamic and evolving movement.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the second takeaway is just the sheer courage and resilience of the activists who fought for change during this incredibly difficult time.
Mm-hmm.
They faced violence, they faced oppression, and in some cases they faced betrayal from the very government that was supposed to protect their rights.
Yeah.
Yet they continued to push forward, demanding a better future for themselves and their communities.
It's inspiring.
And the final takeaway, I think, is that the struggle for racial justice is a marathon, not a sprint. The issues that SNCC and CORE were fighting against, poverty, discrimination, police brutality, those issues are still with us today.
Right.
So their story is a reminder that, the fight for liberation requires sustained effort, strategic thinking, and a willingness to continually challenge the status quo.
The work continues.
It does. And by learning from the past, by understanding the successes and the failures of those who came before us, we can be better equipped to carry that torch forward and work toward a more just and equitable future for all.
Well said. Thanks for guiding us through this fascinating and challenging chapter of history.
It's been my pleasure.
It's given me a lot to think about, and I hope it's done the same for all of you listening out there. So until next time, thanks for joining us for another deep dive.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.